What this wealthy businessman said next made the entire wedding reception go dead silent, and what my assistant whispered in his ear changed everything forever. But first, you need to understand the worthless job he was so eager to mock, and why his assumption nearly destroyed what was supposed to be the happiest day of my brother's life. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the elegant windows of the Riverside Country Club in Charleston, South Carolina, casting golden light across the pristine white tablecloths and crystal champagne flutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My brother Marcus's wedding reception was in full swing, and everything looked picture perfect. The bride, Catherine, was radiant in her designer gown, and Marcus couldn't stop smiling as they made their rounds greeting guests. I stood near the edge of the reception area, quietly observing the celebration while sipping a glass of water. At 34, I preferred staying out of the spotlight at family gatherings like this. I was wearing my best suit, a simple navy blue one I'd bought off the rack at Men's Wearhouse, but even my nicest clothes felt modest compared to the designer attire, worn by most of Catherine's family and friends. My name is David Chen, and for the past 8 years, I've worked as a groundskeeper at the Charleston Veterans Memorial Cemetery. It's not glamorous work. I maintain the graves, plant flowers, repair headstones, and keep the grounds looking respectful for the families who visit their loved ones. Most people hear groundskeeper and think it's just manual labor, cutting, grass and raking leaves. They're not entirely wrong, but they're missing the bigger picture. I became a groundskeeper after completing 3 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger. When I came home in 2016, I struggled with civilian life like many veterans do. The constant noise of the city felt overwhelming after months of hyper-vigilance in combat zones. Office jobs made me feel trapped behind desks and computer screens. But something about the quiet dignity of the cemetery called to me. There's a section dedicated to my fallen brothers from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Every morning, I make sure their graves are perfect, not because it's my job, but because I promised their families I'd watch over them. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who saved my life in Kandahar. Private First Class Williams, who was planning to propose to his girlfriend when we got home. Lieutenant Thompson, who talked about becoming a teacher and coaching Little League. The work isn't just about maintenance, it's about honoring memory. When Gold Star mothers visit for the first time, hands shaking as they touch their son's headstone, I'm there to offer a quiet word of comfort. When elderly World War II veterans struggle to stand as they salute their fallen comrades, I help them up and listen to their stories. When children leave crayon drawings for grandfathers they never got to meet, I make sure those precious gifts are protected from the weather. Working at the cemetery taught me that respect and dignity matter more than money or status. My salary is modest, about $45,000 a year, but it covers my needs. I live in a small apartment, drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and spend most of my free time volunteering with veteran support groups, helping other former soldiers transition back to civilian life. Marcus always understood my choice. He knew that after losing so many friends overseas, I needed work that felt meaningful rather than lucrative. "You're doing something that matters," he'd tell me whenever our parents questioned why I didn't pursue something more ambitious. Those families need someone who understands what their loved ones sacrificed. But Catherine's family? They saw things very differently. From the moment Marcus introduced me to Catherine's parents 6 months ago, I could tell her father, Richard Blackwood, III, wasn't impressed. Richard was a successful commercial real estate developer who owned half the luxury condos downtown. His wife, Patricia, came from old Charleston money and made sure everyone knew it. They lived in a mansion in the historic district, belonged to all the right country clubs, and measured worth by net worth. During that first dinner at their estate, Richard had asked about my career with the kind of polite interest that barely concealed his judgment. When I explained I was a groundskeeper at a veterans cemetery, his smile became strained. "How honest," he'd said, "the way you might compliment a child's finger painting." Patricia had quickly changed the subject to Marcus's promising career in software development, as if my job was too embarrassing to discuss further. The signs were subtle but clear. At family gatherings, Richard would introduce Marcus as our future son-in-law, the successful software engineer, while I was simply Catherine's future brother-in-law. When they discussed wedding expenses, Patricia made comments about contributing what you can while looking pointedly in my direction. They assumed I was struggling financially, living paycheck to paycheck, probably asking Marcus for money. I didn't let it bother me then. Different people value different things, and I'd learned not to let other people's opinions define my worth. Marcus was happy. Catherine seemed to genuinely love him, and that's all that mattered to me. I figured I could endure a few awkward family dinners for my brother's sake. But as I stood at their wedding reception, watching Richard hold court with his business associates near the bar, gesturing dramatically as he told some story about his latest property acquisition, I had no idea that my peaceful, let-it-slide approach was about to be tested in the most public and humiliating way possible. The trouble started during the cocktail hour, about 30 minutes into the reception. I was standing near the dessert table, quietly enjoying a slice of wedding cake, when I overheard Richard's booming voice carrying across the room. He was talking to a group of his wealthy friends, and unfortunately, I was the topic of conversation. "You know, Marcus is a fine young man," Richard was saying, swirling his glass of expensive scotch. "Smart, ambitious, good family values. But his brother—" He paused dramatically, the way people do when they're about to deliver what they think is a particularly clever observation. "Well, let's just say not everyone in the family hit the jackpot in terms of career ambition." His friends chuckled politely, the kind of laugh that wealthy people give when they think they're being witty at someone else's expense. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, but I reminded myself this was Marcus's day. I could handle a little gossip. "What does he do?" asked one of the men, a portly guy with a gold watch that probably cost more than my car. "He's a groundskeeper," Richard announced, saying the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "At a cemetery, no less. Can you imagine? A grown man in his 30s, and that's the best he can do with his life. I mean, I understand some people aren't cut out for real careers, but still." The group murmured their agreement, and I watched as Richard warmed to his theme. He was clearly enjoying himself, playing to his audience like a comedian who'd found his rhythm. "The worst part is, he seems perfectly content with it," Richard continued, his voice getting louder and more animated. "No ambition whatsoever. No drive to better himself. He drives this ancient Honda Civic, lives in some tiny apartment, and acts like he's doing something meaningful. It's honestly embarrassing for the family." I set down my plate, my appetite gone. This wasn't just casual gossip anymore. This was a deliberate character assassination, and it was happening at my brother's wedding. I could see Marcus across the room, laughing with Catherine's cousins, completely unaware of what his new father-in-law was saying about his brother. "I tried to be encouraging," Richard went on, clearly relishing the attention. "I offered to connect him with some people in my network, maybe get him a real job in property management or sales, something with actual potential for advancement. But he just smiled and said he was happy where he was." "Happy? Can you believe that?" The group shook their heads in mock sympathy, like they were discussing someone with a tragic medical condition. "Patricia and I worry about Marcus, honestly," Richard continued. "You know what they say about the company you keep. How can you have real ambition when your own brother is content to be a—" He paused, searching for the most dismissive term possible. "A grass cutter at a graveyard?" That's when I realized Richard wasn't just gossiping. He was actively trying to undermine Marcus's reputation with these influential people. These weren't just random wedding guests. They were Charleston's business elite, people who could affect Marcus's career prospects. Richard was using my perceived failure as a way to diminish Marcus, maybe to ensure his daughter would always be the higher status partner in the marriage. I started moving closer to the group, not to confront them, but to hear more clearly what was being said. I needed to understand exactly how far Richard was willing to go with this character assassination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thing is, Richard was saying, Marcus is brilliant, really brilliant. He's got this software company that's taking off, and he's exactly the kind of son-in-law we hoped Catherine would find. But family baggage, you know? It reflects on all of us. Have you considered just not including the brother and family events? Suggested one of the women, her voice dripping with fake concern. Sometimes it's kinder to everyone involved. Richard laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the elegant atmosphere of the reception. Oh, we couldn't do that. Poor Marcus is very loyal to his family, even when that loyalty is misplaced. He actually thinks his brother's little landscaping job is admirable somehow. Young people these days don't understand that sentiment doesn't pay the bills. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Richard wasn't just mocking my career choice. He was actively working to poison the well against Marcus, using me as ammunition. He was trying to make Marcus look bad by association, to diminish his standing with Charleston's business community. What I don't understand, said another man, is why someone would choose to waste their life like that, especially with military experience. Surely there are better opportunities available. Oh, he's one of those, Richard said dismissively. Thinks his military service entitles him to something special. Probably has PTSD or some other excuse for why he can't handle a real job. You know how these veteran types can be, always looking for sympathy and handouts. That was it. The line had been crossed. Richard had just insulted not just me, but every veteran struggling to find their place in civilian life. He'd reduced my service and my sacrifice to a sympathy play and dismissed the very real challenges that soldiers face when they come home. I could feel my military training kicking in, the same cold, professional focus that had kept me alive in Afghanistan. Richard Blackwood III had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he didn't even know it yet. I walked slowly toward Richard's group, my footsteps silent on the polished marble floor. Years of military training had taught me how to move without drawing attention, and right now, that skill was serving me well. The conversation was still in full swing, with Richard holding court like a king entertaining his subjects. The problem with these veteran types, Richard was saying, gesturing broadly with his Scotch glass, is they think the world owes them something. They come back expecting praise and special treatment, but they can't adapt to the real world. That's why you see so many of them in these dead-end jobs. Groundskeeping, security, manual labor. They just can't compete in today's economy. His audience was nodding along, clearly enjoying this display of superiority. I could see Patricia across the room, chatting with some of Catherine's aunts, completely unaware of the poison her husband was spreading. I mean, look at David, Richard continued, my name dripping with disdain. 34 years old, no real career prospects, no family of his own. What woman would want to settle down with a cemetery worker? It's honestly sad when you think about it. That comment hit differently than the rest. Richard wasn't just attacking my career anymore. He was making it personal, suggesting I was somehow deficient as a man because of my job choice. The coldness in my chest grew stronger, but I maintained my composure. I was close enough now to join the conversation whenever I chose. The military probably damaged him somehow, suggested one of the women, her voice full of fake sympathy. PTSD or brain injury or something like that? It would explain why he can't hold down a proper job. Possibly, Richard agreed thoughtfully. though I suspect it's more about character than anything else. Some people are just natural underachievers. They find their level and stay there, making excuses about meaningful work and serving others. It's a convenient way to avoid real responsibility. I had heard enough, more than enough. I stepped forward into the circle, my movement so smooth and quiet that it took them a moment to realize I was there. When they did, the effect was immediate and satisfying. Richard's face went pale, his Scotch glass freezing halfway to his lips. "Gentlemen." "Ladies," I said calmly, nodding politely to each member of the group. My voice was steady, professional, the same tone I'd used when briefing officers in Afghanistan. I couldn't help but overhear your fascinating discussion about career choices and veteran employment. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly trying to figure out how much I'd heard and how to minimize the damage. His friends suddenly found their drinks very interesting, unable to meet my eyes. "David," Richard finally managed, forcing a weak smile. "I didn't see you there. We were just discussing various career paths, nothing specific." "Oh, I think it was quite specific," I replied, my tone remaining perfectly calm and conversational. "You were explaining to your friends here how veterans like me are damaged goods who can't adapt to the real world. How we use our service as an excuse for our failures. How we're natural underachievers who drag down our families." Richard's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment and anger. "Now see here, you're taking things out of context. I was speaking generally about me," I interrupted gently. "You mentioned my name specifically. You called me a cemetery worker, which is accurate, and suggested that no woman would want to settle down with someone like me. You also implied that my presence at family events reflects poorly on Marcus." The group was shifting uncomfortably now, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. This was supposed to be light entertainment at my expense, not a direct confrontation, where I could defend myself. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Patricia's friend said nervously, trying to defuse the situation. "We should probably rejoin the celebration." "Actually," I said, my voice still perfectly controlled, "I think this is an excellent time to clear up some misconceptions. You seem to have some interesting theories about my career choices and my capabilities." Richard straightened up, apparently deciding that his best defense was a good offense. "Look, David, I understand you might be sensitive about your situation, but facts are facts. You're 34 years old with a minimum wage job and no prospects. That's not an attack. It's reality." "Minimum wage," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting assumption." "Well, what do groundskeepers make?" Richard scoffed. 30, 40,000 a year? That's basically poverty wages in today's economy." I nodded slowly, as if considering his point. "You're right that assumptions can be dangerous things. For instance, you assumed that because I work at a cemetery, I must be struggling financially. You assumed that because I drive an older car and live simply, I must be unsuccessful. You assumed that because I don't talk about my accomplishments, I must not have any." "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard demanded, his voice getting louder. Other wedding guests were starting to notice the commotion. I smiled then, the kind of calm, confident smile that used to unnerve enemy combatants. "It means, Richard, that you're about to learn why making assumptions about people can be a very costly mistake." That's when I saw her, my assistant Sarah Martinez, making her way through the crowd toward us, her expression urgent. She'd been trying to reach me all afternoon, and now she was here. Perfect timing, as always. Sarah Martinez approached our group with the kind of urgent energy that immediately commanded attention. At 28, she was one of the most competent people I'd ever worked with. Harvard MBA, fluent in 4 languages, and the kind of sharp intelligence that could cut through corporate red tape like a hot knife through butter. She was also, as Richard was about to discover, my executive assistant. "Mr. Chen," she said breathlessly, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the reception hall. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have an urgent call from Singapore. The Meridian Group is demanding an answer on the Henderson project tonight, and the Tokyo office is waiting for your decision on the infrastructure deal." The effect on Richard's group was immediate and electric. Every head turned toward Sarah, then back to me, confusion written across their faces. The woman who'd been making snide comments about PTSD actually took a step backward. "Singapore can wait until Monday," I replied calmly, as if billion-dollar international deals were a routine interruption at family weddings. "And tell Tokyo that we'll proceed with Phase 1 of the infrastructure project, but I want the environmental impact assessment completed before we commit to Phase 2. Sarah nodded, making notes on her phone. "Should I reschedule tomorrow's board meeting with the Mayor's Economic Development Council? You're supposed to present the waterfront revitalization proposal." "No, we'll keep that meeting," I said. "The city's been waiting long enough for those plans." Richard's face had gone from red to white to an alarming shade of green. His scotch glass was trembling in his hand, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to process what he was hearing. "Board meeting?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him with polite curiosity, as if noticing him for the first time. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Sarah Martinez, executive assistant to Mr. Chen. You must be Mr. Blackwood. I recognize you from the Charleston Business Journal article about the downtown development competition." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Richard's business associates were staring at me like I'd just sprouted wings, and I could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in their eyes. "Wait," said the portly man with the gold watch, his voice shaking slightly. "David Chen? You're D. Chen? From Chen Development Group?" I nodded modestly. "Guilty as charged." "Oh my God," whispered one of the women. "You're the Chen who's been buying up half the commercial real estate in the Southeast. The Chen who just closed that $2 billion deal with the Port Authority." "Among other things," I confirmed. Richard's scotch glass slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet reception area. Heads were turning our way, including Marcus and Catherine, who started walking over to see what the commotion was about. "I don't understand," Richard stammered, his entire worldview crumbling in real time. "You're a groundskeeper. You drive a Honda Civic. You live in an apartment." "I am a groundskeeper," I agreed. "That's my day job, so to speak, the work I do that feeds my soul. But you're right. I also have other responsibilities. Chen Development Group, Chen Foundation, the Veteran Housing Initiative, the Scholarship Program for Gold Star families." Sarah, bless her, was enjoying this almost as much as I was. "Mr. Chen prefers to keep his business and personal life separate," she explained to the stunned group. "He believes in leading by example rather than by reputation." But why?" Richard sputtered. "Why would someone with your resources work as a groundskeeper?" Before I could answer, Marcus arrived with Catherine, both of them looking concerned about the broken glass and the crowd that had formed around us. "Everything okay here?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the group. "Your brother," said one of Richard's friends, his voice full of awe, "is D. Chen, the D. Chen." Marcus grinned proudly. "Yeah, he is. Didn't mention that, did you, David?" He turned to Richard, who was still standing there looking like he'd been struck by lightning. "Dad, meet my brother, the one who's been personally funding the Veterans Housing Project that your company has been trying to get the contract for." Catherine's face went pale as she looked between her father and me. "Oh no," she whispered. "Daddy, what did you do?" The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the drama and the broken glass. I could see Patricia pushing through the guests, her face a mask of social mortification, as she realized something had gone very, very wrong with her husband's networking session. Richard opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been making fun of a lion while standing in its cage. Well, I said finally, straightening my off-the-rack suit jacket, I think we've cleared up those assumptions about career choices and veteran capabilities. The revelation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. 15 seconds during which Richard Blackwood III, Charleston's self-proclaimed king of commercial real estate, realized he had just spent the better part of an hour publicly humiliating one of the most powerful men in the Southeast. Patricia finally reached our group, her social radar having detected the disaster from across the room. She took one look at her husband's ashen face, the broken glass at his feet, and the crowd of wedding guests who had stopped their conversations to stare, and I could see her mentally calculating the damage. "Richard?" she said carefully, her voice carrying that particular tone wives use when they suspect their husbands have done something catastrophically stupid. "What's going on here?" Before Richard could answer, one of his business associates, the man with the gold watch whose name I now remembered was Harold Peterson, cleared his throat nervously. "Patricia," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about David's, career situation." Patricia looked confused, glancing between her husband and me. What kind of misunderstanding? Sarah, who had been watching this unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing a train wreck in slow motion, stepped forward helpfully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Sarah Martinez, Mr. Chen's executive assistant. I believe your husband was under the impression that Mr. Chen's only source of income was his groundskeeping work at the Veterans Cemetery." The color drained from Patricia's face as the implications hit her. She wasn't stupid, far from it. She'd grown up in Charleston society, and she knew exactly who D. Chen was. Everyone in their social circle knew about the mysterious billionaire who'd been quietly buying up prime real estate throughout the city, the philanthropist behind the new Veterans Hospital, the man whose development company had transformed half the waterfront. "Oh no," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Oh, Richard, no. Please tell me you didn't." "I didn't know," Richard exploded, his voice cracking with desperation. "How was I supposed to know? He drives a Honda. He works at a cemetery. He lives in some tiny apartment." Marcus stepped closer to me, and I could see the protective instinct kicking in. My little brother had always been my defender, even when we were kids. "David chooses to live simply because he believes in it," Marcus said firmly. "Just because someone doesn't flaunt their wealth doesn't mean they don't have it." "But why?" Patricia asked, her voice genuinely bewildered. "Why would someone with your resources work as a groundskeeper?" I looked around at the crowd that had formed, wedding guests who had come to celebrate Marcus and Catherine's love, now witnessing what was essentially a public humiliation. This wasn't what I'd wanted. This wasn't what Marcus deserved on his wedding day. "Because," I said quietly, "taking care of my fallen brothers isn't about money. It's about honor. It's about keeping promises I made to dying soldiers. It's about making sure their families know their sacrifice meant something." The crowd grew even quieter at that, if such a thing were possible. Several of the older guests, men who looked like they might have served in Vietnam or Korea, nodded with understanding. "Every morning when I go to work," I continued, "I visit Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's grave. He died saving my life in Afghanistan. His mother comes by every Sunday after church, and we talk about her son. She brings flowers that I help her plant. Tell me, Richard, what's the dollar value of that conversation? What's the market rate for keeping a promise to a dead hero?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in the entire confrontation, he seemed to understand that he'd attacked something sacred, something that couldn't be measured in profit margins or property values. Catherine had tears in her eyes as she looked between her father and me. "Daddy," she said softly, "you need to apologize. Right now." "Catherine's right," Patricia said, her voice sharp with embarrassment and anger, though I wasn't sure if the anger was directed at Richard or at the situation in general. This is completely unacceptable behavior. But Richard's pride was still warring with his obvious terror at the social and business implications of what he'd done. I was just making conversation, he stammered. I didn't mean anything personal by it. Harold Peterson, clearly trying to salvage his own reputation, jumped in. David, Mr. Chen, I want you to know that I had no idea Richard was going to... that the conversation would turn so inappropriate. If I had known... Known what? I asked gently. Known that I wasn't actually poor? Would that have made the conversation more appropriate somehow? Harold's face flushed red as he realized the trap he'd walked into. No, that's not... I didn't mean... Because here's the thing, I continued, my voice still calm but carrying clearly across the now silent reception area. Richard wasn't wrong about everything. I do make $45,000 a year as a groundskeeper. I do drive a 10-year-old Honda. I do live in a small apartment. Those facts haven't changed just because you now know about my other activities. Sarah was taking notes on her phone, and I could see several other people in the crowd doing the same thing. In the age of social media, nothing stayed private for long, especially when it involved Charleston's elite behaving badly at social events. The question, I said, looking directly at Richard, is whether you think your comments were appropriate when you thought I was just a poor veteran trying to get by. Part 6, Richard's face went through a series of emotions as he processed my question. I could see him struggling between his wounded pride and the dawning realization of just how badly he'd miscalculated. The question hung in the air like a sword. Were his comments appropriate when he thought I was just a poor veteran? Richard started, then stopped. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, his wife's mortified expression, his daughter's disappointed tears, his business associates' barely concealed horror, and the growing crowd of wedding guests who were all waiting for his answer. The answer, said a gravelly voice from behind the crowd, is absolutely not. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. An elderly man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo was making his way through the guests, using a walking cane but moving with unmistakable authority. I recognized him immediately. General William Hayes, retired Army, now serving on the Charleston City Council. Marcus had mentioned inviting some of Catherine's family friends, but I hadn't realized the general would be among them. General Hayes, Patricia breathed, her voice filled with even more dread. If this situation wasn't contained quickly, it would be all over Charleston's social circles by morning. The general stepped into our circle, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Richard. Son, he said, and despite Richard being well into his 50s, the word carried the weight of absolute authority. I've been standing over there for the past 10 minutes, listening to you mock a veteran's service and a man's honest work, and I've got to tell you, I've seen some disgraceful behavior in my time, but this ranks right up there with the worst of it. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. You didn't argue with General Hayes, not if you had any sense. The man was a Charleston institution, a decorated war hero who'd served in Vietnam and later commanded forces in the Gulf War. General, there's been a misunderstanding, Patricia tried to interject, but Hayes held up a hand. Ma'am, I've been listening to this whole conversation. There's no misunderstanding here. Your husband spent the better part of an hour telling anyone who'd listen that this young man was worthless because he chose meaningful work over a fat paycheck. The general's voice carried clearly across the reception area, and I could see other guests nodding in agreement. But we didn't know... Richard finally found his voice. Didn't know what? The general cut him off. Didn't know he was wealthy? So that makes it okay to mock a man's honest work? To suggest that veterans are damaged goods who can't compete in the real world? To imply that groundskeeping, taking care of our fallen heroes, is somehow beneath dignity? The general turned to address the crowd that had formed around us. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to hear this clearly. This young man," he gestured toward me, "chooses to spend his days maintaining the final resting places of American heroes. He could sit in a corner office somewhere, counting his money, but instead he gets up every morning and tends to the graves of soldiers who died for our freedom." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. I could see several people nodding, and one woman, I think she was Catherine's great-aunt, actually started clapping softly. "And this man," the general continued, pointing his cane at Richard, "thought that was something to mock. Thought it was appropriate dinner conversation to belittle a veteran's service and a man's character." Richard looked like he wanted to crawl under the nearest table. "General Hayes, I assure you, I meant no disrespect to veterans or—" "Then what exactly did you mean?" the general interrupted. "Because from where I was standing, it sounded like you were suggesting that this young man was somehow deficient because he chose service over profit." Catherine stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, please, just apologize. This is my wedding day, and you're ruining it." For a moment, I thought Richard might actually do it. I could see the love for his daughter warring with his wounded pride. But then his business instincts kicked in, and he made what might have been the worst decision of his life. "Now wait just a minute," Richard said, his voice rising. "I think everyone's being a bit dramatic here. I was having a private conversation with friends. If David chose to eavesdrop—" "Private," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp with anger. "Dad, you were talking loud enough for half the reception to hear you. And you weren't just gossiping. You were actively trying to damage my reputation by association." "That's ridiculous," Richard protested. "I would never—" "You told them I was brilliant but had family baggage," I said quietly. "You suggested that my presence at family events reflected poorly on everyone. You wondered aloud whether Marcus's loyalty to me was misplaced." The crowd's murmur grew louder, and not in Richard's favor. Several people were shaking their heads in disgust. Patricia grabbed her husband's arm. "Richard, stop talking. Right now. Apologize to David and end this." But Richard's pride wouldn't let him back down. "I was protecting my daughter's interests," he said defensively. "Any father would be concerned about—" "About what?" Catherine snapped, her voice breaking. "About having a war hero for a brother-in-law? About marrying into a family where people actually do meaningful work instead of just talking about money all the time?" That's when Sarah stepped forward again, her phone in her hand. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I hate to interrupt, but I've been getting calls. Word is already spreading about this situation. The Charleston Post and Courier is asking for comment." The blood drained from Richard's face as he realized this was no longer just a family argument. It was about to become a very public scandal. The mention of the Charleston Post and Courier hit Richard like a physical blow. His face went from red to white in seconds, and I could practically see him calculating the business implications of having his classist rant about veterans become front-page news in the morning. "The media?" Patricia whispered, her hand clutching her pearl necklace. "Oh God, Richard, what have you done?" But Richard wasn't ready to surrender yet. Instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his position, perhaps thinking that aggressive confidence might somehow salvage the situation. "This is getting blown completely out of proportion," he declared, raising his voice so the entire reception could hear him. "I made some observations about career choices in what I thought was a private conversation. Now everyone's acting like I committed some kind of crime." General Hayes stepped closer, his cane tapping ominously on the marble floor. "Son, let me explain something to you about holes. When you find yourself in one, the first rule is to stop digging." "With all due respect, General," Richard shot back, his business arrogance overriding his survival instincts. "This is a family matter. I don't need career advice from someone who spent their life on a government paycheck." The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Even the wedding band, which had been playing softly in the background, seemed to stop mid-note. General Hayes raised his eyebrows slowly, and I could see the dangerous glint in his eyes that had probably terrified junior officers for decades. "Did this man," he said, speaking to the crowd but never taking his eyes off Richard, "just dismiss military service as living on a government paycheck?" The murmur that rippled through the crowd wasn't friendly. Charleston was a military town, with a strong tradition of respecting veterans and active service members. Richard had just insulted not only me and the general, but half the people at his daughter's wedding. "That's not what I meant," Richard backpedaled desperately. "I was just saying that civilian business experience is what?" I asked quietly, stepping forward. "More valuable than military service, more honorable than dedicating your life to protecting others." "More practical," Richard snapped, apparently deciding that if he was going down, he might as well make it spectacular. "Look, I respect what you did overseas, but at some point, you have to grow up and join the real world. You can't live on glory stories forever." That was it. That was the moment Richard Blackwood III sealed his fate. Catherine let out a sound that was part sob, part scream of frustration. "Daddy, stop! Please just stop talking!" But Marcus had heard enough. My gentle software engineer brother stepped forward with an expression I'd rarely seen on his face. Pure, protective fury. "Glory stories?" Marcus said, his voice shaking. With rage. "Glory stories? Do you want to know what my brother's glory stories actually are, Richard?" "Marcus, don't," I said quietly, recognizing the dangerous territory we were entering. But Marcus was beyond listening. "He doesn't talk about Afghanistan much, but I know some things. I know he carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. I know he spent 2 weeks in a Taliban prison after his convoy was ambushed. I know he has nightmares about friends who didn't make it home. But sure, let's call those glory stories." The crowd was listening with rapt attention now. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was Marcus defending his brother's honor in the most public way possible. "And you want to know why he works?" "At that cemetery?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent reception hall. "Because when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was dying from an IED explosion, he asked David to promise that someone would take care of his grave. Because when Private Williams was bleeding out in David's arms, he made David swear that his family would know he died thinking of them. Those aren't glory stories, Richard. Those are sacred promises." Catherine was openly crying now, her wedding makeup running down her cheeks. Several other guests were wiping their eyes, and I could see phones being held up. People were recording this confrontation. "So when my brother gets up every morning and goes to work at that cemetery," Marcus said, his voice getting stronger, "he's not doing it for the money. He's not doing it because he can't handle the real world. He's doing it because he made promises to dying heroes, and David Chen has never broken a promise in his life." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Patricia grabbed his arm with both hands. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't say another word." But the damage was done. Richard had crossed every possible line, insulting veterans, dismissing military service, mocking the sacrifice of fallen soldiers, and suggesting that honoring the dead was somehow childish. Sarah stepped forward again, her phone buzzing constantly. "Mr. Chen, I'm sorry, but Channel 5 is here. They're setting up outside and they want a statement." "Television news?" Patricia gasped. "Oh my God, Richard, do you realize what you've done? Do you understand what this is going to do to your business? To our reputation?" For the first time, Richard seemed to grasp the magnitude of his situation. His commercial real estate empire depended on relationships with city officials, many of whom were veterans. His social standing in Charleston relied on community respect, and he had just publicly attacked both military service and the care of fallen soldiers at his daughter's wedding, in front of Charleston's elite, with the media now involved. I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said weakly, finally trying to retreat. But it was far too late for that. The phrase "too late" had never felt more accurate. As Richard stood there, finally understanding the magnitude of his situation, the consequences of his choices began cascading around him like dominoes falling in perfect, devastating sequence. Harold Peterson, the man with the gold watch who had been so eager to participate in mocking me earlier, was the first to abandon ship. "Richard," he said, backing away from our group, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never agreed with anything you said about veterans or anyone's career choices." "Harold, you were laughing right along with—" Richard started desperately. "I was being polite." Harold cut him off smoothly, his tone making it clear he'd never admit to anything else. "I certainly never endorsed any disrespectful comments about our military heroes." The other business associates quickly followed Harold's lead, distancing themselves with the practiced ease of people who'd spent their careers avoiding association with scandal. Within minutes, Richard found himself standing alone in his designer tuxedo, abandoned by the very people who had encouraged his cruel commentary just an hour earlier. But the personal betrayals were just the beginning. Sarah approached me again, her expression grim. "Mr. Chen, I've been monitoring the situation online. Someone uploaded video of the confrontation to social media. It's already been shared over 3,000 times in the past 10 minutes. I looked around and saw multiple phones pointed in our direction. The modern curse of social media meant that Richard's meltdown was being broadcast live to half of Charleston and probably beyond. "What's trending?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Charleston wedding scandal and the raw Richard Blackwood thread are both gaining traction," Sarah reported. "The comments are not favorable to Mr. Blackwood." Patricia overheard this exchange and looked like she might faint. "Social media?" she whispered. "Richard, people are talking about this on social media?" Before Richard could answer, General Fay Hayes stepped forward again. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing crises, "I think you need to get your husband out of here. Now. Before he makes this any worse." "Worse?" Richard sputtered. "How could this possibly get worse?" As if summoned by his question, a woman in a business suit approached our group, flanked by a cameraman and a man carrying a boom microphone. The reporter moved with the confident stride of someone who smelled a big story. "Mr. Blackwood?" she called out. "Jennifer Walsh, Channel 5 News. Could we get a comment about your statements regarding veterans and military service?" The wedding reception, which had been buzzing with conversation and scandal, went completely silent. Every guest turned to watch as Richard faced the local news media, his social and business reputation hanging in the balance. This is a private family event," Richard stammered, clearly unprepared for the professional scrutiny of a trained journalist. "But the statements were made in a public setting," Jennifer Walsh pressed, her tone politely aggressive. "We have multiple witnesses and video evidence of you suggesting that veterans are damaged goods who can't adapt to civilian life. Do you stand by those comments?" "That's not—" "I never said—" Richard looked desperately at Patricia, who was staring at him with the expression of someone watching a natural disaster unfold. Catherine broke away from Marcus and walked directly up to the reporter. "I'm Catherine Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite her tear-streaked face. "This is my wedding day, and I want to make something absolutely clear." The camera immediately focused on her, and I could see the reporter's eyes light up. The bride commenting on her father's scandal would make compelling television. "My father's comments do not represent my views, my family's values, or anyone else at this wedding," Catherine said clearly. "David Chen is a war hero who chose to honor fallen soldiers by maintaining their final resting place. His work is meaningful, honorable, and necessary. Anyone who can't see that is—" She paused, looking back at her father with disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Anyone who can't see that is someone I'm ashamed to be related to. The collective gasp from the wedding guests was audible. Catherine had just publicly disowned her father on live television, at her own wedding, in front of Charleston's social elite. Richard's face crumpled. "Catherine, sweetheart, please. I'm your father. I was just trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Catherine shot back. "From having a brother-in-law who keeps promises to dead soldiers? From joining a family that values service over status? From marrying a man whose brother is a better person than my own father?" Marcus stepped up beside his new wife, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of solidarity. "Catherine's right," he said, addressing the camera directly. "My brother David is the best man I know. He could buy and sell half the businesses in Charleston, but he chooses to spend his days caring for heroes who can't care for themselves. If Mr. Blackwood can't respect that, then he doesn't deserve to be part of our family." The reporter turned to me, microphone extended. "Mr. Chen, would you like to respond to Mr. Blackwood's characterization of your work and military service?" Looked at the camera, then at Richard's devastated face, then at Marcus and Catherine standing together in defiance of her father's prejudice. This moment would define not just how Charleston saw Richard Blackwood, but how they saw the values we all claim to share. "I think," I said quietly, "the response has already been given. By people who understand what honor actually means." The aftermath of my quiet response to the reporter created a moment of profound silence that seemed to stretch across the entire reception hall. Richard stood there, isolated and defeated, while the camera continued rolling and the weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical force. Patricia, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally stepped forward. Her face was a mask of barely controlled emotion, anger, embarrassment, and what looked like genuine grief for the man she thought she'd married. "Richard," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I think you need to leave. Now." Richard looked at his wife with desperate eyes. "Patricia, please, this is our daughter's wedding. We can't just—" "We," Patricia interrupted, her voice rising. "We. You did this, Richard. You and your pride and your need to make everyone else feel small so you could feel big." She looked around at the crowd of guests, her friends and family, all staring at the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. "You've embarrassed our family in front of everyone we know. You've insulted a war hero on our daughter's wedding day. You've made me ashamed to be your wife." The finality in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about their marriage, their life together, everything they'd built over the years. Richard's face crumpled further. "Patricia, I was trying to protect Catherine. I was trying to make sure she married into a good family." "She did marry into a good family," Patricia cut him off. "The Chens are good people. David is a good man who does meaningful work and honors his fallen friends. Marcus is brilliant and kind, and he loves our daughter. This is a good family, Richard. The problem isn't them, it's you." The reporter, sensing the story was shifting into even more compelling territory, stepped closer with her microphone. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying you disagree with your husband's assessment of your new son-in-law's family?" Patricia turned to face the camera directly, her voice steady despite the emotional tremor. "I'm saying my husband has shown a side of himself tonight that I've never seen before, and I'm horrified by it. David Chen is a decorated veteran who chooses to honor fallen soldiers. That's not failure, that's character. And anyone who can't see the difference has lost their way." She turned back to Richard, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the silent reception hall. "Go home, Richard. Just go home." Richard looked around desperately, seeking support from someone, anyone. But his business associates had melted away. His family was aligned against him. and the wedding guests were watching him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. "Catherine," he tried one last time, reaching toward his daughter. "Sweetheart, please. I'm your father. I love you. I was just trying to—" "No," Catherine said firmly, stepping back. "You weren't trying to protect me. You were trying to control me. You were trying to make sure I stayed in your world, where money matters more than character and status matters more than service." She wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara, but her voice remained strong. "I don't want to live in that world anymore, Daddy. I want to live in a world where people like David are valued for who they are, not judged for what they have." The camera captured every word, every tear, every moment of family fracture playing out on what should have been one of the happiest days of Catherine's life. General Hayes, who had been observing the family drama with the tactical awareness of a career military officer, stepped forward again. "Son," he said to Richard, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have two choices here. You can leave quietly with whatever dignity you have left, or you can continue making this worse for everyone involved. But I'm going to tell you something. If you stay, if you keep talking, if you keep trying to justify what you've said tonight, you're going to find that Charleston is a very small town for a man who's insulted its heroes." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. General Hayes wasn't just speaking as one man. He was speaking for Charleston's veteran community, its military families, and everyone who understood the value of service over self. Richard's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation finally hit him. He looked around the reception hall one more time, seeing the faces of people who had been his friends, his business partners, his social circle. Now they were strangers, witnesses to his humiliation, people who would remember this night for years to come. He started, then stopped. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo the damage, repair the relationships, or restore the respect he'd lost. Sarah approached me quietly, her phone in hand. "Mr. Chen," she said softly, "I've been monitoring the situation. The story has already been picked up by 3 major news outlets. It's going to be much bigger than just local coverage." I nodded, understanding the implications. Richard's prejudice and my response would become a case study in how quickly social media could amplify a story, how quickly a man's reputation could be destroyed by his own words. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, addressing Richard directly for what I suspected would be the last time. "I hope you understand that this didn't have to happen. All you had to do was treat people with basic human decency." Richard met my eyes for a moment, and I saw something there. Not just defeat, but a glimmer of understanding. Perhaps in that moment he finally grasped what he had lost and why. Richard's departure from his daughter's wedding was as pathetic as it was final. He walked toward the exit with the shuffling gait of a man who had aged 10 years in the span of an hour, leaving behind the wreckage of relationships that had taken decades to build. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor echoed through the silent reception hall, each step marking the end of his place in his daughter's life. Patricia didn't follow him. She stood with her chin raised, watching her husband of 28, years leave alone, and I could see the mixture of pain and relief in her expression. She had made her choice, and it wasn't him. As the door closed behind Richard, the tension in the room seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. The wedding. Guests who had been frozen in fascination and horror began to move and whisper among themselves, but their conversations weren't returning to normal wedding chatter. They were processing what they had just witnessed. The reporter from Channel 5 approached Patricia with professional sensitivity. "Mrs. Blackwood, would you like to make any additional comments about tonight's events?" Patricia looked at the camera with the composure of someone who had spent 30 years in Charleston society and knew how to handle a crisis. "I want everyone to understand that my husband's views tonight do not represent our family's values. We have always supported our military, and we are honored to welcome David Chen into our family. His service to our country and his dedication to honoring fallen heroes deserves our deepest respect, not mockery." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued with quiet dignity. "I also want to apologize to everyone whose wedding celebration was disrupted by this situation. This should have been a joyful evening celebrating Marcus and Catherine's love, and I'm sorry that my husband chose to turn it into something else." The reporter nodded respectfully and turned to General Hayes. "General, as a military leader and community figure, how do you respond to what happened here tonight?" General Hayes straightened to his full height, every inch the commanding officer despite his retirement. "What we witnessed tonight was a perfect example of the disconnect between those who understand service and sacrifice and those who measure worth only in dollars and social status." His voice carried the authority of decades of leadership. "David Chen represents the best of American values. He served his country with distinction, and now he serves his fallen brothers with the same dedication. Any community would be proud to have him." He glanced around the reception hall, his eyes taking in the faces of Charleston's elite. "And any community that would mock such service, that would ridicule such dedication, needs to take a long, hard look at its priorities." Catherine, who had been standing silently beside Marcus, stepped forward. Despite her ruined makeup and the emotional trauma of publicly rejecting her father, she carried herself with remarkable dignity. "I want to say something," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. The crowd turned toward her, and the camera focused on her face. "Today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and in many ways, it still is. I married the man I love, and I gained the brother I never had." She looked directly at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "David, I'm sorry for what my father said. I'm sorry you had to endure that on what should have been a celebration. But I want you to know that I'm proud to be your sister. I'm proud to be part of a family that values character over wealth, service over status." The spontaneous applause that followed her words started with General Hayes and spread throughout the reception hall. Even the camera operator was nodding, in approval. Marcus put his arm around Catherine and addressed the crowd. "My wife is right. This day was supposed to be about love, about family, about the promise we made to support each other through everything life throws at us." He looked around the room, his eyes settling on the faces of friends and family. "What happened tonight was unfortunate, but it also showed us who we really are. It showed us what we value. It showed us what kind of family we want to be." Sarah approached me with updates that painted a picture of the broader implications of the evening's events. "Mr. Chen, the story is trending nationally now. Veteran respect and troik service over status are both gaining traction. The reaction has been overwhelmingly supportive of you and critical of Mr. Blackwood." She scrolled through her phone, reading snippets of social media responses. "Veterans organizations are sharing the story. The VFW posted a statement supporting your work at the cemetery. Even some major corporations are commenting about the importance of respecting military service. But perhaps the most significant development was yet to come." As the evening wound down and the camera crews packed up their equipment, several wedding guests approached me with unexpected revelations. Harold Peterson, the same man who had so eagerly participated in mocking me earlier and then abandoned Richard when the situation soured, came forward with obvious discomfort. "David," he said awkwardly, "I need to tell you something. My company has been trying to get a meeting with Chen Development Group for 6 months. We've been hoping to partner on the waterfront project." He swallowed hard, the irony not lost on anyone within earshot. "I had no idea you were... I didn't realize." I looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch until he shifted uncomfortably. "Harold," I said finally, "I think tonight taught us all something about the importance of treating people with respect regardless of who we think they are." The message was clear, and Harold nodded shamefully before walking away. As the evening progressed and the initial shock of the confrontation began to settle, something unexpected happened. Instead of the wedding reception ending in disaster, it transformed into something more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. Guests, rather than leaving early due to the drama, seemed drawn together by what they had witnessed. Conversations throughout the reception hall weren't about the usual wedding topics, the flowers, the music, the food, but about service, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to honor others. I found myself surrounded by people I'd never met, wedding guests who wanted to share their own stories about military service, about family members who had served, about the importance of remembering those who had given everything for their country. An elderly woman named Margaret, who turned out to be Catherine's great-aunt, approached me with tears in her eyes. "My son served in Iraq," she said quietly. "He came home, but he was never the same. He struggled for years before he finally found his peace." She paused, composing herself. "What you do at that cemetery, it matters. It matters more than people, like Richard will ever understand." A younger man, probably in his 30s, overheard our conversation and joined us. "I'm a Marine veteran," he said, extending his hand. "2 tours in Afghanistan. When I came home, I worked construction for a while, then landscaping, trying to find something that felt right. People kept asking me why I wasn't using my leadership skills in some corporate job, why I was wasting my potential on manual labor." He smiled, but there was pain behind it. They didn't understand that after what I'd seen, after losing friends, the idea of sitting in a boardroom arguing about profit margins felt meaningless. I needed to do something that mattered, something that honored what we'd been through. These conversations were happening all around the reception hall. The confrontation with Richard had opened something up, created a space for people to talk about values that usually went unspoken in polite society. General Hayes found me during one of these conversations and pulled me aside. "Son," he said, "I've been thinking about what happened tonight, and I want you to know something. What Richard said, what he did, it wasn't just about you. It was about every veteran who's ever struggled to find their place in civilian life. Every service member who's ever been judged for choosing meaning over money." He paused, looking around the reception hall at the ongoing conversations. "But look what came out of it. Look at these people talking about service, about sacrifice, about what really matters. Sometimes it takes someone like Richard showing their true colors to remind the rest of us what we actually believe in." Sarah approached us with more updates about the expanding story. "Mr. Chen, I've been monitoring the national coverage. The story has been picked up by CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. But more importantly, veterans organizations across the country are using this as a teachable moment about the transition from military to civilian life and the different ways veterans choose to continue serving." She showed me her phone screen. The American Legion issued a statement about the dignity of all honest work. The VFW started a social media campaign called Dark Service Continues, highlighting veterans who chose meaningful work over high-paying careers. The story has become bigger than what happened here tonight. It's become a national conversation about how we value service. But perhaps the most surprising development came when Patricia approached me with a proposal that no one could have anticipated. "David," she said, her voice still shaky from the evening's events but determined, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll consider it seriously." I nodded, curious about what Catherine's mother could possibly want to discuss after everything that had happened. "I've been thinking about Richard's business, about the company he built, about the employees who work for him," she continued. "What happened tonight isn't going to stay contained to this wedding. His reputation is destroyed, and that's going to affect everyone who depends on Blackwood development for their livelihoods." She took a deep breath. "I want to make this right. Somehow. I can't undo what Richard said, but I can try to ensure that the consequences don't destroy innocent people's lives." I'm going to divorce him, and when I do, I'll have significant assets from the settlement. The direction of her conversation was becoming clear, but I let her continue. I want to invest in your development company, she said firmly. I want to be part of something that builds communities instead of just generating profits. I want to work with someone who understands that success means more than just money. Before I could respond, she held up her hand. I know this might seem sudden, but I've been watching you tonight. I've seen how you handled Richard's attacks with dignity, how you've treated everyone here with respect despite what you've endured. I've also done my research on Chen Development Group. You're not just successful, you're ethical. You hire veterans, you build affordable housing, you contribute to the community. She looked around the reception hall, where her daughter was, finally smiling again, dancing with Marcus while their guests continued their meaningful conversations about service and values. I want to be part of something good, Patricia said simply. I want to spend the rest of my life building things up instead of tearing people down. Will you consider letting me invest in your vision? The offer was unexpected, generous, and complicated, in ways that would take weeks to sort through. But it represented something important: redemption. The possibility that even from Richard's cruelty, something positive could emerge. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed. I woke up in my small apartment, the same modest place Richard had mocked, to find my phone buzzing with notifications from around the world. The story had gone truly global overnight. Sarah called me at 7 a.m. with an update that was both overwhelming and humbling. Mr. Chen, I've been monitoring the international coverage. The BBC picked up the story, as did news outlets in Australia, Canada, and several European countries. But more importantly, veteran organizations globally are using your story to highlight similar issues in their own countries. She paused, scrolling through her notes. The response has been unprecedented. We've received over 3,000 emails in the past 12 hours, veterans sharing their own stories, civilians apologizing for their assumptions about military service, business leaders pledging to hire more veterans. But the most significant developments were happening right here in Charleston. By 9 a.m., Sarah informed me that Blackwood Development's phones were ringing nonstop, but not with new business, with cancellations. The luxury condo project that Richard had been bragging about the night before? 3 major investors had pulled out overnight. The city contract his company had been competing for? The mayor's office had quietly indicated that they would be exploring other options. It's not just the business consequences, Sarah explained as she showed me the morning's Charleston Post and Courier. The headline read, "Wedding Night Scandal Reveals True Character." Below, it was a photo of Richard walking away from the reception, alone and defeated, contrasted with a picture of me in my military dress uniform from my Army service. The editorial, written by the newspaper's veteran affairs columnist, was devastating. In one evening, Richard Blackwood III revealed more about his character than 3 decades of business success ever could. His public mockery of a decorated veteran's choice to honor fallen soldiers represents everything wrong with a society that measures worth by wealth rather than character. But the morning brought more than just consequences for Richard. It brought opportunities that I had never expected. General Hayes called personally to invite me to speak at the Charleston Veterans Day ceremony, an honor typically reserved for the highest-ranking military officials. "Son," he said, "after last night, you've become a voice for veterans who choose service over profit. The community needs to hear from you." The mayor's office called with an unexpected offer. They wanted me to chair a new commission on veteran employment and housing. The position would come with significant resources and the authority to implement real change for struggling veterans throughout the region. Most surprisingly, I received a call from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs in Washington. "Mr. Chen," his aide explained, The secretary saw your story on the news last night and wants to discuss having you testify before Congress about veteran employment challenges and the dignity of all honest work. These opportunities were humbling, but they also represented something larger than personal recognition. They represented the chance to turn Richard's cruelty into genuine change for veterans across the country. Around noon, Patricia arrived at my apartment, another first. She looked composed but tired, the weight of the previous evening evident in her eyes. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night," she said, settling into the simple chair in my modest living room. "About the business partnership. I've spent the morning with my attorneys, and I want you to know I'm serious about this investment." She handed me a folder of documents. "These are preliminary papers for divorcing Richard and dissolving our joint business interests. I'll have significant assets to invest, and I want to put them towards something meaningful." Patricia looked around my apartment, the same humble space that Richard had mocked, and smiled sadly. "You know, I used to think success looked like our mansion, like Richard's expensive cars and designer suits. But sitting here, in this simple place where an honest man lives while he builds something extraordinary, I realize I've been measuring everything wrong." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. This came from Catherine this morning. The message read, "Mom, I'm proud of you for standing up to Dad. David and Marcus are lucky to have you on their side. Love you." For the first time in years, Patricia said, my daughter is proud of me, not because of what I own or who I'm married to, but because of what I chose to stand for. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock at my door. When I opened it, I found Marcus and Catherine, both looking much happier than they had the night before. "We wanted to check on you," Catherine said, giving me a hug, "and to thank you." "Thank me?" I asked, confused. Marcus grinned. "For showing us what real strength looks like. For teaching us that dignity isn't about fighting back. It's about staying true to your values even when people attack them." Catherine nodded. "And for showing me that I married into the right family. A family that knows the difference between having class and having money." As we sat together in my small living room, the billionaire in his modest apartment, the society matron seeking redemption, and the newlyweds who had chosen love over status, I realized that Richard's attack had accomplished the opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of exposing my supposed failures, he had revealed the strength of the values I'd built my life around. Instead of driving wedges between family members, he had united us in something deeper than blood or marriage, shared principles about what truly mattered in life. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. In trying to make me look small, Richard had made himself smaller than anyone could have imagined. 3 weeks later, the ripple effects of that wedding night had transformed into tsunami-sized changes that none of us could have anticipated. I was sitting in my office at Chen Development Group, reviewing architectural plans for the new veteran housing complex, when Sarah knocked and entered with an expression I'd learned to recognize. She had news that would change everything again. "Mr. Chen, Richard Blackwood wants to meet with you." I looked up from the blueprints, genuinely surprised. "Richard? After everything that's happened?" Sarah nodded, consulting her notes. "His attorney called this morning. Apparently, Mr. Blackwood is facing bankruptcy. The business has collapsed completely. All major contracts canceled, investors withdrawn. Even his personal assets are being liquidated to cover debts and legal fees." She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she had to say next. "He's asking for 15 minutes of your time. He says he wants to apologize in person and ask for your help." The irony was staggering. The man who had publicly mocked my poor job was now asking for assistance from the very person he'd humiliated. But there was something else in Sarah's expression that told me this wasn't just about business. "There's more, isn't there?" I asked. "Patricia filed for divorce yesterday," Sarah confirmed. "Catherine hasn't spoken to him since the wedding. He's essentially lost everything. Family, business, reputation, social standing. According to his attorney, he's been staying in a motel room for the past week. I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. 3 weeks ago, Richard Blackwood had been one of Charleston's most prominent businessmen. Now he was destitute, alone, and asking for help from the man he'd called a failure. "What kind of help is he asking for?" I inquired. Sarah consulted her. Notes again. "Employment. He's asking if you have any positions available in your company. Any positions at all." The request was almost incomprehensible in its reversal of circumstances. Richard Blackwood III, who had suggested I was too damaged to handle real work, was now begging for a job from Chen Development Group. "Schedule the meeting," I said after a long moment. "But make it here, in my office, and I want you to sit in on it." That afternoon, the man who walked into my office bore little resemblance to the arrogant developer who had held court at his daughter's wedding just 3 weeks earlier. Richard looked like he had aged a decade. His expensive suit, replaced by off-the-rack clothing, his confident swagger replaced by the hesitant shuffle of someone who had lost everything. "David," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chairs across from my desk. "Please, sit down." Richard settled into the chair, his hands shaking slightly. The man who had once dismissed military service as living on a government paycheck now sat in my office, hat in hand, asking for mercy from a veteran. "I suppose you know why I'm here," he began, unable to meet my eyes. "Why don't you tell me?" I replied calmly. Richard took a shaky breath. "I've lost everything. The business, the house, the cars, all gone. Patricia left me and Catherine—" His voice broke. "Catherine won't take my calls. I haven't spoken to my daughter in 3 weeks. He finally looked up at me, and I could see genuine anguish in his eyes. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I know that everything that's happened to me is my own fault. But I'm desperate, David. I need work, any work, and you're the only person in Charleston who might be willing to give me a chance." The silence in the office stretched for several moments. Sarah was taking notes, documenting what might be one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in Charleston's recent history. "What kind of work are you looking for?" I asked finally. Richard swallowed hard. "Anything. I'll take anything you're willing to offer. I know I don't deserve your consideration, but I'm asking anyway." I studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance and prejudice that had led to his downfall. What I saw instead was a broken man who had finally learned the cost of his cruelty. "Richard," I said quietly, 3 weeks ago, you suggested that I was a failure because I chose meaningful work over maximum profit. You mocked my service to my country and my dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. You tried to damage my brother's reputation and suggested that my presence at family events was embarrassing. Richard winced at each point, his face growing paler. I know all of that, and I hate myself for it. But here's what interests me," I continued. "You're not just asking for a job from someone you publicly humiliated. You're asking for a job from someone whose work you called worthless, whose lifestyle you mocked, whose values you dismissed as naive." I leaned forward. "So I have to ask, what's changed? Do you still think my work is meaningless? Do you still believe that veterans are damaged goods who can't compete in the real world? Do you still think that choosing service over profit is a sign of failure?" Richard was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he faced the full weight of his prejudices and their consequences. "No," he whispered. "I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about you, wrong about service, wrong about what matters. In life? I thought success meant having more than other people, being better than other people, looking down on people who had less." He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "But you had everything I thought I wanted. And you chose to spend your days honoring dead soldiers. You chose meaning over money, and I was too proud and too stupid to understand what that meant." I studied Richard's tear-streaked face for a long moment, weighing my response carefully. The man sitting across from me had lost everything, but more importantly, he seemed to have finally understood why he'd lost it. The question now was whether his transformation was genuine or simply the desperation of a man with no other options. "Richard," I said finally, "I'm going to offer you something, but it's not what you're expecting, and it comes with conditions that might be harder for you to accept than unemployment." He looked up hopefully, wiping his eyes. "Anything. I'll do anything." "I'm not going to offer you a position at Chen Development Group," I said, watching his face fall. "But I am going to offer you something more valuable, a chance to understand what service actually means." Sarah looked up from her notes, as surprised as Richard by the direction this was taking. "There's an opening at the Charleston Veterans Memorial Cemetery," I continued, "groundskeeping position. It pays $42,000 a year, about the same as what you mockingly called my poor job 3 weeks ago." Richard's eyes widened as he processed what I was offering. "The job involves maintaining the graves of fallen heroes," I continued. "You'd be working with your hands, getting dirty, doing the kind of manual labor you once considered beneath your dignity. You'd report to the cemetery supervisor, who happens to be a Vietnam veteran named Tom Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's older brother." I leaned forward. "But here's the most important part, Richard. If you take this job, you'll spend every day surrounded by the graves of men and women who gave their lives for their country. You'll learn their names, their stories, their sacrifices. You'll meet their families, their children, their Gold Star mothers who still come to visit decades later." Richard was listening intently, and I could see him beginning to understand the significance of what I was proposing. "This isn't charity," I continued. "This is an opportunity for you to learn what I've spent the last 8 years learning, that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, and real success isn't measured by what you can buy. It's measured by how you serve others, how you honor those who came before you, and how you use whatever time you have left to make a difference." Sarah was writing furiously, capturing what was essentially a masterclass in redemption and second chances. "The conditions are these," I said. "You work there for 1 full year. You learn every name in the veterans section. You attend every memorial service, every family visit, every ceremony. You listen to the stories, you hear the pain, you understand the sacrifice." I paused, letting the weight of the commitment sink in. "After 1 year? If Tom Rodriguez tells me that you've truly understood what it means to serve others instead of yourself, if you've shown genuine respect for the men and women buried there, then we'll talk about other opportunities. But, Richard, if you take this job as a stepping stone to something you consider better, if you approach it with anything less than complete dedication and respect, you'll be fired immediately." Richard sat in stunned silence for several minutes. I could see him wrestling with the offer. Steady employment versus his remaining pride. Survival versus the humiliation of taking the exact job he'd mocked. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why would you do this for me after what I did to you?" I thought about that question, about the anger I could justifiably feel, about the satisfaction of watching his downfall, about the easy revenge of simply refusing his request. "Because 3 weeks ago, you taught me something important," I said. "You showed me that there are people in this world who judge others by their possessions instead of their character, who measure worth by wealth instead of service. But you also showed me that those people aren't evil, they're just lost." I gestured toward the window, where the Charleston Veterans Memorial Cemetery was visible in the distance. "I've spent 8 years working among heroes who died for strangers, who sacrificed everything for people they'd never meet. If they could give their lives for someone else's freedom, I think I can give you a chance to find your way back to being a decent human being." Richard was crying again, but these tears seemed different, less desperate, more grateful. "I'll take it," he said quietly. "I'll take the job, and I'll do everything you've asked. I'll learn their names, I'll honor their service. I'll try to become the man I should have been all along." Sarah handed him a tissue box, and he took several, trying to compose himself. "There's one more condition," I added. "Every morning when you arrive at work, you'll spend 5 minutes at Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's grave. You'll think about what he died for, what his sacrifice meant, and what it means that his brother is now your supervisor." Richard nodded. "I understand." "And Richard," I said as he prepared to leave, "this offer comes with no guarantees beyond the 1 year. What happens after that depends entirely on you. Tom Rodriguez will be watching, the families will be watching, and the men and women buried there will be watching. Don't disappoint them." As Richard left my office, walking with the uncertain gait of a man whose world had been completely rebuilt, in the span of an hour, Sarah looked at me with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I have to ask, why? Why give him this chance when he was so cruel to you?" I looked out the window toward the cemetery where I'd spent so many meaningful mornings, where Richard would soon begin his own journey toward understanding what service really meant. Because I said, sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to help the living find their way back to being human. 1 year later, I stood at the entrance of the Charleston Veterans Memorial Cemetery, watching the sunrise paint the headstones in golden light. It was Memorial Day morning, and the annual ceremony would begin in 2 hours. But first, I had a promise to keep. I walked through the familiar pathways, past the graves I'd tended for so many years, toward the newer section where we'd recently buried Captain James Morrison, a young Marine who'd lost his battle with PTSD. His family would be here today, and I wanted to make sure everything was perfect for them. As I rounded the corner near the World War II section, I saw a figure kneeling beside Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's grave. Richard Blackwood was there, as he had been every morning for the past 365 days, spending his 5 minutes in quiet reflection. He looked different, not just physically, though the year of outdoor work had weathered his hands and face. There was something deeper that had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity that came from understanding what real service looked like. "Good morning, Richard," I said, approaching the grave. He looked up and smiled, not the calculated smile of a businessman, but the genuine expression of someone who had found peace. "Good morning, David. Beautiful day for the ceremony. Over." The past year, Richard had kept every promise he'd made in my office. He'd learned the names of every veteran buried in the cemetery, all 1,247 of them. He'd attended every funeral, every memorial service, every family visit. He'd listened to countless stories of sacrifice and loss, and slowly, something fundamental had changed within him. Tom Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's brother and Richard's supervisor, had become an unlikely mentor. The gruff Vietnam veteran had initially been skeptical of Richard's motives, but over the months, he'd watched Richard transform from a desperate man seeking employment into someone who genuinely understood the sacred nature of their work. "He's not the same person who walked in here a year ago," Tom had told me just last week. "That man was broken by pride. This man has been rebuilt by purpose." As if summoned by our conversation, Tom appeared on the path, walking with his characteristic limp, a souvenir from Khe-San. "Morning, boss," he called to me, then nodded to Richard. "Rich, you ready for today? We've got families coming from 3 states. Richard stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Everything's ready, Tom. I double-checked all the arrangements this morning." I watched this interaction with deep satisfaction. Richard had not only learned to do the work, he had learned to do it with the respect and dedication it deserved. More importantly, he had earned the respect of his co-workers, men and women who served our nation's heroes every day. The 3 of us walked together toward the main ceremony area, where volunteers were setting up chairs and sound equipment. Richard excused himself to help with the preparations, and Tom and I continued toward the memorial wall. "You know," Tom said, watching Richard organize flower arrangements, When you first told me you were sending him here, I thought you'd lost your mind. But I understand now what you were doing." "What's that?" I asked, though I suspected I knew his answer. "You were giving him the same gift this place gave you, the chance to understand what really matters." Tom paused at his brother's grave, the same spot where Richard had spent every morning for a year. Miguel always said that the best way to honor the dead was to help the living become better people. I think he'd approve of what you did. As the morning progressed and families began arriving for the ceremony, I reflected on everything that had happened since Marcus's wedding. The viral video, the national conversation about veteran employment, the opportunities to speak before Congress, all of it had stemmed from one man's cruel words and my decision to respond with dignity rather than anger. Patricia had become not just an investor in Chen Development Group, but a genuine advocate for veteran causes. She and Richard had never reconciled. Some damage couldn't be repaired, but she'd found her own path to redemption through meaningful work. Marcus and Catherine were expecting their first child, a daughter they'd already decided to name Hope. Catherine had become one of Charleston's most prominent advocates for military families, using her social connections to raise both awareness and funds for veteran support programs. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Richard himself. The man who had mocked my poor job had discovered that the work he'd ridiculed was the most meaningful he'd ever done. The cemetery had given him what his business empire never could, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal gain. As I took the podium to address the Memorial Day crowd, I looked out at the faces gathered to honor our fallen heroes, veterans and civilians, families who had lost loved ones, and communities who understood the cost of freedom. In the front row, I saw Marcus and Catherine, Patricia sitting beside them. Tom Rodriguez was in his dress uniform, his chest decorated with the medals he'd earned in Vietnam, and there, in the back, was Richard Blackwood, wearing the simple khaki uniform of cemetery grounds crew, standing at attention as the color guard presented the flags. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we gather today not just to remember those who gave their lives for our freedom, but to recommit ourselves to the values they died defending. Values that have nothing to do with what we own and everything to do with how we serve others." The crowd listened intently as I shared stories of the heroes buried around us, men and women who had chosen service over self, sacrifice over safety, others over themselves. The greatest lesson these heroes teach us, I concluded, is that our worth isn't measured by our wealth, our success isn't defined by our status, and our legacy isn't determined by what we accumulated, but by how we lifted others up. As the attire ceremony ended and families dispersed to visit their loved ones' graves, Richard approached me one final time. "David," he said, "I want you to know that this year has been the most important of my life. Not because it saved me from bankruptcy, but because it saved me from myself." He paused, looking around at the cemetery he now knew as well as I did. "You could have destroyed me completely after what I did at the wedding. Instead, you gave me the chance to become the person I should have been all along. I can never repay that gift." I smiled, thinking of all the lessons this sacred ground had taught both of us. "Richard, the only payment required is that you continue to honor these heroes by living the values they died for. Pass that lesson on to others, and the debt is paid." As we parted ways that Memorial Day morning, I realized that the story that began with cruelty at a wedding had become something much larger, a testament to the power of redemption, the importance of second chances, and the truth that real wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we give to others. Some stories end with justice, others end with revenge, but the best stories end with transformation and hope.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.